Hi guys, Mark here again. Thanks for joining me, by the way, for Cross Lights and our re-examination of the end times. This is episode 13, and we are moving into chapter 8 of my book, The Threshold of Exile. And if you haven't picked up a copy yet, I'd certainly encourage you to pick one up. By the way, I've permanently kept the price back down at $19.99, where we did for the Christmas special. I just think I want to make the book more affordable, more accessible. It's not about money; it's about getting it into people's hands. One of the challenges that I'm finding, and as I was just reviewing this material this week for today's podcast, is I kind of had to go back over a little bit about what's popular today about this idea of the Abomination of Desolation, and that's what we're going to be talking about in chapter 8 as we're getting into this Olivet Discourse. And Jesus has taken the disciples through the season of basically where the focal point is in a broader sense the Roman Empire, the wars and rumors of wars and famines and earthquakes and things that are going on that are more or less empire-wide. And the final exclamation point on this empire-wide perspective is that the gospel, as we saw last time, would be preached throughout the whole world, and then the end would come. So now we're going to narrow down on what events are going to bring about the end. But as we deal with this, like we've always been dealing with, the part of the challenge for me is there's so much that we have to unlearn. It would be so great just to be able to sit here and teach you, a good historical perspective on this discourse. But when so many of us, maybe many of you who are watching, I've been schooled under, as I was in my earlier years as a Christian, this whole idea, and I actually kind of reviewed it a little bit this week just to get come back to my old thoughts. This whole idea of this coming 7-year tribulation and this abomination of desolation has to do with a future Antichrist, sometime maybe in our time or sometime near in the future, that in the middle of this 7-year coming tribulation period, you're going to have an Antichrist who's going to, defile the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem by setting up a throne and demanding worship. And of course, in the course of all this, we know we learn that there's this great incoming or ingathering of Jews to Jerusalem, back to the Holy Land, and only to find out that 2/3 of them are going to be killed off in this whole scenario in the end times. And my gosh, this stuff gets so ingrained in people's minds. I read something just recently that was just almost boggled my mind, that a brother had spent some time in, I believe it was Russia, and working with some missionaries there, and he ran into not only one but several organizations who were working tirelessly to get the Jews out of Russia to get them back to Israel for the end times, and because they were trying to bring about the end. And of course, in their mind, 2/3 of these souls, poor souls, were going to be killed off in the tribulation. And the brother was kind of asking him, well, have you shared the gospel with these people? Well, no, we've got to get them back to Israel for the end times. And it's like, something wrong with this scenario, people. This is the kind of thing that is bred by this theology. And of course, in reviewing some of this stuff and some of the teachings and some of the thoughts of some of the people that espouse these teachings, I was really, again, drawn back, appalled almost, at how texts that have everything to do with maybe the Jews returning from Babylon, or just this pick and choose isolation of texts that say things and they're simply applied to the end of the world or to the tribulation, that really say no such thing. And I'm not going to spend our time going through all of those. My hope is that just by you seeing this historical context of the New Testament and how Jesus was speaking to 12 men about things that were going to happen in their time, that in itself can help to wash away some of these other ideas, because all of this other stuff makes for great theater, but is it really true? That's the question. Now, when we're looking at something like this, and as I said, this focal point now turns from this larger context of the Roman Empire, and Jesus begins to speak about tells his disciples, when you see the abomination of desolation. Of course, he's talking to his disciples, and this is in Matthew 24:15. He says that when you see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, and those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whosoever is on the mountaintop must not go down and get things out of that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in winter or Sabbath. Now, again, bringing this back to the context of the first century, Jesus is preparing the disciples for what we learned was the end. Okay, he told the disciples that the gospel would go out to the world. He answered their question, when will the end come? And he tells them when the end would come. Now he's telling us how the end will come about, and it will begin with this thing called the Abomination of Desolation. Now, in understanding this, one of the things that I kind of thought about this week, and we should explain a little bit better in a moment what that means, the Abomination of Desolation, probably better referred to as the abomination that causes the desolation. Jesus spoke of the desolation that would be in Matthew 23. He told the Jews, your house will be left to you desolate. And now he's going to explain of what causes that desolation. But there's an interesting gloss, I think, that's added in here by both Matthew and Mark in their versions of this account. And they says, let the reader understand. This is actually quite insightful, because when Matthew and Mark put this in the story, they realized, or they knew, or may even have been told by Jesus, that they themselves would not be allowed alive to see this. Most of the apostles, by the time this happens during the Jewish-Roman War, most, if not all, the apostles had already been died off, been martyred. And so what this suggests to me is that these Gospels were already in circulation by the time of the Jewish-Roman War. And so they were warning that they themselves, the disciples, these apostles, may not see this event, but those who are reading their accounts, their memoirs, would actually see this or observe it, many of them who would be in Jerusalem. And the whole context of this is for them to flee, because Jerusalem would be about to be destroyed. Now we're going to discuss that further, but this was in preparation for the first hint that the end of the age would come with that destruction of the temple that we spoke of early. But I just thought it was very interesting that this whole account has this little note in there for those who would read and would not have heard directly maybe from the apostles, or that the apostles themselves might not see this. And that it gives me the indication, this is my opinion, it gives me the indication that this information was in circulation, written form, before the fall of Jerusalem, for the churches to read and know what was happening and be warned, especially those in Jerusalem, to get out, because the end was coming. The Romans were going to surround the city. Now, that surrounding of the city, by the way, is given to us. We see three different accounts of this warning in Matthew, in Mark, and in Luke, and they're all dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, some scholars would try to take Luke's statement where he says that, and on page 113 we kind of have this in a harmony table where Matthew and Mark say when you see the abomination of desolation, and then in Luke it says when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that somehow this suggests that Luke is talking about another event. He's talking about destruction of Jerusalem, but Matthew and Mark are talking about the end of the world. The problem I have with that is very simple. We have to go back when you have these kinds of difficulties in interpretation. We have to go back to our anchor, okay? The anchor that we have in this text, there's several of them. Jesus said that these are things that would happen, that the disciples would see them. Secondly, he tells us down the road here a little bit that this generation would not pass away until all these things take place. But as a matter of fact, there's a very interesting literary device in this text that indicates that the whole thing speaks of one context, and that is this. In Matthew 23, we have the first portion of what's called an inclusio. Inclusio, let me get the definition of that for you. I have it handy here in my some of my papers that I had somewhere here. Okay, inclusio. Let me just give you kind of a textbook definition of the inclusio. It's the repetition of the same language at the beginning and end of a section of literature forming bookends. So an inclusio tells the reader that what's in the middle of the two bookends is support or an explanation of what words are making up the bookends. In its most basic form, an inclusio is a phrase or idea that occurs in the beginning of a stretch of text and is repeated at the end. Now, what's significant about that? Well, in Matthew 23:36, Jesus says these words, "All these things shall come upon this generation," as he was telling the Jewish leadership that a desolation would occur. Okay, so we have this idea of desolation coming upon this generation. He's speaking obviously of the generation there of those Pharisees that he was talking to. But when we go down to Matthew 24, first of all, Jesus has already mentioned desolation here in our text in Matthew 24:15. But then at the end of this narrative, or at the end of this particular portion of the narrative, he uses the same phrase, "This generation shall not pass away." So we now have these bookends between this entire narrative that says this generation, this desolation is going to come upon this generation, and Jesus telling us in Matthew 24 that this desolation will come upon this generation. It would be seen by this generation. And this forms what we call in literature an inclusio, so that everything in between pertains to the same thing, you see? And so now we have a context both in a literary sense, but not only do we have that, but we have the statement of Jesus telling the disciples that they would see these things, and or their readers would see these things as they occurred within that time frame of the first century. So we see Matthew speaking of an abomination. Now, what an abomination of desolation? Abomination was something spoken about in the Old Testament as utterly detestable to God. Not only to God, it could be to anyone. The shepherds were an abomination to the Egyptians, okay? And so it's something that's utterly detestable. And in this case, the abomination that makes desolate or causes desolation is something that would be utterly detestable to God. Something is going to happen. Matthew tells us it's something that would be in the holy place. And by the way, in the Greek text, the definite article "the" is not actually in the text. It's matter of fact, one version, I think it's literal version, says that the abomination would be standing in a holy place. Now that may or may not be significant, okay, because we're going to be talking about things that happened in the first century at the onset of the war, the Jewish war, that would actually fulfill this very well, okay? So we have Matthew speaking to what appears to be those Jews in the vicinity of Jerusalem and Judea, because as we said, Matthew's gospel was oriented toward this more of a Judean culture in and around Jerusalem. Mark's gospel says you'll see it standing where it ought not to be. And that's a very interesting statement, Mark 13:14. We have to think in terms of Mark's gospel, as we have said, has a kind of Roman flavor, but he's also got Jews in mind as well, because there's still a lot of Jewishness in Mark's gospel. That's why he refers to it as the Abomination of Desolation, because there was not only a Jewish population in and around northern Galilee, but there was also a strong Roman presence, okay? And there were many, the archaeology has discovered many Greco-Roman indicators that there was a strong Greco-Roman influence in and around Galilee. And so I think Mark's perspective goes farther up into maybe northern Galilee, where he's concerned about Romans, he's concerned about Jews. And he says, you'll simply see this standing where it ought not to be. Then we go into Luke's account, and he's more into a Greek orientation, and so his audience may not even be familiar with this concept of Abomination of Desolation, which arises out of Daniel the prophet. And Daniel mentions this several times in his prophecies in Daniel 8, Daniel 11, Daniel 12. We see him talking largely about the Syrian ruler Antiochus and putting a statue of Zeus in the temple, sacrifice of a pig, and some things like that happened in the temple. But specifically in Daniel chapter 9, we get this prophecy of the 70 weeks, where we see this countdown to Messiah, and we learn that there will be, at the end of his ministry, there will be this overspreading of abominations that brings about desolation. And I think that's what most scholars believe that that's what Jesus is talking about. We will take a little time maybe to review Daniel 9. I'm not going to get into it right now today. I just wanted to give you an idea that there's a Jewish background to this idea that may have not been significant for Luke's readers, but Luke gives us a concurrent sign, and that is at the time Jerusalem, that the armies are marching toward and surrounding Jerusalem, will be the same time that the Abomination of Desolation is taking place in the temple in possibly a similar manner as it did back in the days of Antiochus. And so the point is that we have that these three inspired authors are speaking of the same events with slight variations for their audience. And this is exactly what we learned when the original question was asked in Matthew 24:3. We saw responses from each of these gospel writers from a perspective that was suitable to the inquiry of their audience. And here we have the same thing. This Abomination of Desolation is like that initial question that they asked. It's very, very unfortunate here that many who do not see this as one unified presentation of the first century. I have in my hand, in my library, some excellent harmonies of the gospel, where you have the four gospels harmonized, sort of on a chapter by chapter, verse by verse, where you can compare what one writer says compared to the other, and you can see that distinction as they approach different audiences. But I was very, very disappointed to see how some otherwise excellent harmonies of the gospel. And these harmonies, by the way, are not inspired. They're the author's best attempt to align the gospel stories between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But I was really just surprised, and you'll see this on page 114 of the book. I'm trying to give you a little piece of that on the for those who are watching the video to see a little visuals of this. But when you look at this these three accounts in harmony. Let those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Mark says, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Luke says, let those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Who's ever on the housetop, Matthew says. Who's ever on the housetop, Mark says. Those who are in the city must leave, Luke says. Who's ever in the field must not turn back, Mark says, and Matthew says in verse 18. The one that's in the field must not turn back in Mark verse 16, 13, 16. Those who are in the country must not enter the city. And so you have this almost identical language that is slightly different for each audience, and then there is a statement that that Luke makes, that these are the days of vengeance, so that all things which are written would be fulfilled. So Luke sees this as now the time when all the things that were written about the judgment on Jerusalem, the day of the Lord, these are the things that would now be fulfilled. And he tells his audience that it would be their sign, their indicator would be that you would see the march of Rome beginning to surround the city of Jerusalem in their day, and that would be the sign. But for those possibly in regions of Galilee, they might see the presence of the army, and Mark just simply describes it as something that is where it ought not to be. But Matthew describes something for those who are in the city, and he says that there's an abomination in the holy place. Okay, so we will explain that a little bit farther, but all three of these things have a common historical reference. Okay, and as I said, it's just a shame that these harmonies tend to have a bias toward futurism. On page 116 again, Matthew 24:15, when you see the abomination of desolation. Mark 13 says, when you see the abomination of desolation. Luke 21:20 says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. So all of this context up to that point has almost identical language. And then in the harmonies, what happens, as you can see on the chart on page 116, is Luke 21:20, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, is conveniently moved out of alignment with, which to say, well, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that's not the same as the abomination of desolation. Well, it may not be the same as the abomination, but it is an indicator of something happening concurrently with the abomination of desolation. Okay, and if we go farther into this whole harmonization, Matthew 24 goes on to say in verse 21, for then there shall be great tribulation. And in Mark 13 he says there shall be time of great tribulation. Luke 21:23 says there will be great distress upon the land. Again, the language is the same. It's just suitable to a different audience. Okay, and it's just really, really unfortunate to see how strong these biases are. And I don't mean to criticize any scholar. I don't mean to criticize any scholar's work. But I would ask you to go back, if you don't have the book, go online yourself and look up Harmony of the Gospels and read the Olivet Discourse. And as you go through this line by line across the three accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, ask yourself, are these guys talking about two different eras of time? Or are they simply describing the same events from a different perspective? Okay? So let's take a few minutes now just to talk about this idea of what is meant by the abomination in the holy place. Now, the holy place is an interesting idea because it for those of you who are not familiar with the design of the tabernacle and the temple, in the book on page 20, basically beginning on page 19, 20, 20, and 121, you've got a couple of diagrams here that show you, but the original tabernacle of Moses and the Solomon's temple, and then Herod's revisions of the the temple that was rebuilt after the return from Babylon, they all were the same. They had two major divisions. There was the outer court, and then there was the sanctuary proper. And you can see that on the illustration there. But the sanctuary, the inner sanctuary under the tent was separated into two different compartments. The first was the holy place. It was called the holy place, and the priest offered showbread or bread of the presence, kept the golden candlestick lit, and maintained the altar of incense there. And then the second was the innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, which was separated from that other compartment by a veil. And that particular place was where the Ark of the Covenant rested, where it was described, beautiful golden chest with two winged cherubim, and was only entered once a year by the high priest, and there he came with the blood of sacrifice on the Day of Atonement. The Jews call it Yom Kippur, and he sprinkled the blood of the sacrifice on the mercy seat to atone for the blood of the people. It was the holiest place on the planet for the entire era of Moses, okay? And now Matthew mentions this, that the abomination would take place in the holy place. The book goes into some interesting analysis of the Greek text of Matthew. He doesn't really use a phrase that's common in the Septuagint in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. He uses kind of a unique phrase. He uses the phrase topohagio, and it's not really a phrase that's used to describe the holy place. It speaks more of a holy topography or a holy area, because in the book of Hebrews, these places are merely referred to as Hagia or Hagia Hagion, and so it's kind of interesting that Matthew uses a strange and different phrase, and it could allow for that Matthew's terminology might actually allow for the abomination of which Jesus speaks could actually be the Roman armies surrounding the holy area or the holy ground or overall landscape of Jerusalem. And that's discussed on page 122. But in reality, I think Matthew is probably referring to the holy place in the temple. And something horrible happened in history at that time, during the midst of the Jewish-Roman War, that was concurrent with the Roman armies descending upon the city. And it certainly fits the intent of understanding this whole idea of the abomination of desolation taking place in the first century. But we're going to have to stop for now, and you're going to have to pick that up at the next session. At section 14, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that that happened historically, and then I'm also going to get into in the next week or two this discussion of Antichrist, which is so popular today, and we're going to look at what the Bible has to say about Antichrist, and you may be surprised to discover it doesn't say as much as some people think it does. But anyway, that's it for lesson 13. I want to thank you so much for joining me. God bless you and richly, and I look forward to seeing you next time. And if you get a chance, pick up the book. I think it will be helpful to you.